Hello and welcome to this lesson on writing task 1 for the academic module of the IELTS exam. So this is lesson 6 and it's on bar graphs. Bar graphs are similar to tables and pie charts in that how you respond to the question depends on the type of data being presented in that particular question. And there's more than one possibility. So if you haven't seen lesson 4 on line graphs and lesson 5 on pie charts, I would watch those first, because essentially what you need to decide for these types of questions is, are you dealing with data which is simply describing differences between categories, or with changes over time or changes between points in time? And so the answer to that question is going to determine exactly how you respond to whatever question you're dealing with. And rather than think of questions as it's a pie chart question, or it's a bar graph question, or it's a tables question, it would be more useful to think of, it's a type of question where you have to talk about the differences between categories, and those differences are presented in a pie chart, or are presented in pie charts, or bar graphs, or in a table, something like that. So in all of these question types, you'll have ones where you don't have to deal with time, ones where you only have to deal with differences between categories. You have others where you have to deal with the differences at different points in time. A line graph obviously is changes over time, or you may have a question that asks you to deal with both differences in categories and differences in time. So really understanding, what kind of data you're being presented with rather than the type of graph it is much more important. And so in lessons 4 on line graphs and 5 on pie charts, I go over the major distinctions that you'll find between these types of data and how they're presented in IELTS questions. So those lessons are much longer as they go into like the real differences, whereas the lesson on bar graphs, tables, multiple graphs, simply present a bar graphs or multiple graphs or tables question and then talk about the differences in the context of that question. So I wanted to be able to go over all the different graphs that are presented, but really the main issue, as I mentioned, is understanding the type of data that you're being presented with. So like the other lessons, what we're going to do is look at a question and then look at one in depth from the website. So you'll find lots of information listed. You'll find lots of information listed in the lesson notes, which is under the video on the website IELTScompass.com. And you can either check that out before you continue with this lesson or have a look at it later. But some of the material that I'll be using in the lesson comes from the website. Okay, so here's an old bar graphs question. I believe this is from Cambridge 5. Any of the Cambridge books from 5 and after are fine for using questions. The exam was a slightly different format before book 5, so I wouldn't use those except for in certain purposes, but I tried to use the earlier ones where I had to use a Cambridge book question just because the numbers of each question type are limited, and I know people prefer to practice from the newer ones, but you will find similar questions like this in newer editions and on the exam now. And so if you think about what do you see before you even read the question, okay, you've got 2 bar graphs, they're on different things, and this is quite common in a bar graphs question where you will have 2 different ones and they're on like the same topic, but you don't necessarily have to make comparisons between the 2 bar graphs. So it's a little bit like a multiple graphs question in this sense, but it is very common with bar graphs questions. So there is some relation. You may have to compare them, but in this particular one, you don't. So it says the charts below show the main reasons for study among students of different age groups and the amount of support they received from employers. Okay, so the first one is reasons for study according to age of student and the amount of employer support they receive by age group. So these are students who are also employed. So we see this one, there's no time, no reference to any year or anything. Again, you'll get bar graphs questions where you deal with things happening in a particular year or years. And you'll get questions like this where there's no reference to time. That will tell you not only about the kind of information, the way that you present the data, but can also help you with things like verb tenses. So obviously, if you're dealing with different times in the past, you'll definitely be using the past tense. To some extent, that would also work with a question like this. If you're referring to the data in a study that was done in the past, that could work. Most people tend to use a use the present tense to describe this as just describing general information or description, and that also works well. So depending on how you do it, either of those ways would be fine. Again, just remember, make sure that you're communicating clearly and appropriately for whatever context you are writing about. So first of all, we think there's our information that we want for our introduction, right? We want three things to happen in our report. So introduce what the graphs are talking about, give an overview, the basic summary, and go into detail about the basic details of the features we mentioned in our summary or overview. So the charts below show the main reasons for study among students of different age groups and the amount of support they receive from employers. So paraphrasing that, describing in a slightly different way, that's all you need to do. For your introductory sentence, sometimes, most people will write it as one sentence. If it's easier for you to write it as two sentences, that doesn't matter. That's absolutely fine, as long as the information is clear. Never try to go beyond your capacity with the language simply to meet some demand like that. Well, usually it's one sentence. Well, for me, I can't write one sentence that contains all the information, so I'm going to break it up into two sentences, shorter sentences, and my sentences will be more accurate. And for that, the information will be clearer. So again, that's an important consideration always, regardless of the question. And then if we think, what type of information are we going to have to talk about? So the two aspects are reasons for study according to age of student. So the ages are below, under 26 up to over 49, and there are two types of study: studying for your career, light gray; studying for interest, dark gray. And then the bar graph below is simply the different age groups and how much support they get from their employer by age group. So let's think about overview. So again, this is generally highest, lowest, increases, decreases, things like that. So you can kind of draw a line like that. Now we're not talking about time, so it's not an increase in that respect. But, this one's going up and this one's going down. So we can say this one, as people get older, they study less for career and more for interest. So that's part of our overview. That's the main aspect of our overview, one of them. The other thing is this one. So there's this kind of pattern, but which ones are getting the most and the least? So there, that's the least, but is that really relevant that it's that age group? What we're looking for is a broader pattern. So basically younger people tend to get more support, and then it's sort of variable. We might mention this also, that younger people tend to get more support, with the one exception being those in the highest age group also tend to get a significant amount of support, a more significant amount of support. So essentially what we've got for our overview is these three bits of information. So the reasons for study show a kind of contrasting pattern. The numbers of those studying for interest is higher the older student is, and those studying for career is highest among the youngest students. Young students tend to study for career reasons. Older students tend to study out of interest. And the second one, employer support is greatest among younger students, with the exception being that those in the 49 and over age group also receive a considerable amount of support, something like that. That's our information. That's all we need for our overview. And so in a way, like, this is kind of like a multiple graphs question where you talk about one and the other, and there is a kind of connection between the two, but you don't make comparisons between the two. You just mention the information. So for our details paragraph, so as we said, this bit here is our introduction. What I just went over here is our overview, and then that's one details paragraph, and that's the other details paragraph. So I mean, this is 4 paragraphs, very easy to do it that way. Each of these bar graphs in a separate paragraph. It's really the only logical way to do it, because you can't make any comparisons between them. They're kind of complementary bits of information on the same topic. So that's really all you need to do for this one. In terms of data, so if we talk about our details paragraph, we would definitely, again, one of these paragraphs would be for one details paragraph. Sorry, one of these bar graphs would be for one details paragraph and the other for the other. And we're not going to make comparisons directly between those, so that's really the only logical way to do it. But if you think about how much data do we have to report, so look at the number of bars. So for career, light gray, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. For interest, dark gray, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Employer support, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all in percentage. So we've got 15 bits of information. Now that's kind of borderline, like depending on the kind of information you're given, you could include all of that in your report, probably within 200 words, but do you need to? And if you think about your line graphs questions, the ones where the data is kind of continuous and constant like this, you don't report every category or every time listed on this axis down here. You would probably give like the first one and the last one. So you could say something like, so the reasons for studying were highest for career among the young, with around 80% for those under 26, and then dropping to less than 20% for those over 49. You might give one point in the middle, age 30 to 39, but you really don't need to give every single point. You're mentioning the category, that's the light gray lines and the dark gray lines, and you're mentioning a few of the data points to give data in numbers, in figures, as you have to do according to the band descriptors. So you could skip a few of those. That would save you a bit of time, and it wouldn't affect the clarity or the completeness of your report. For this one down here, I mean, these are all kind of different enough that I would probably just do all of them. So employer support was highest among younger students. This would be the number of students getting support. So we're just over 60% of those under 26 getting support, around 50% of those 26 to 29 getting support. The numbers drop off from there, with age 30 to 39 receiving around just over 30%, and age 40 to 49 receiving slightly more than that. The exception is, and then once we are dealing with students over the age of 49, there is an increase in the amount of support paid by employers to more than 40% of those students. So it really depends on how you see this. Like this is definitely worth noting. Younger students have more support. Do you want to talk about these as two kind of similar examples of older students getting less support? And this is a third one where, as they're getting older again, they're getting more support. Maybe they're getting more support because over 49 is a bigger age group than 40 to 49. Who knows? So it really doesn't matter. Again, you could describe these just as three distinct points and then keep the pattern here with these parts. So it really doesn't matter, but describe those 5 points. Describe the direction for the type of study and the age of the students for the first graph. And if you do that, you should be fine for this one. It's quite straightforward, really. Okay, so if we have a look at the information on the website, so we'll look at the bar graphs question. One thing I just want to mention is to reiterate what I was talking about here. So I used the pie charts question, and I took the exact same data and put it into a bar graph. Again, this is not likely to happen for these particular questions. Pie charts would be better than a bar graph. I just did this to show that really you can express the same data in different types of graphs, and that's the main reason why it's a good idea to think of the type of data in terms of changes over time, points in time, differences in categories, a mix of those things. And so that's something worth thinking about. I know for me, when I first saw this in a class that I took when I was at university, the same data represented in several different graphical representations. For me, it was kind of eye-opening, thinking, oh, okay, it's not that you always use bar graphs for this or you always use pie charts for this. It's that these are different ways of looking at the same data, and there are preferable types of graph for different types of data. Where the numbers add up to 100% like they do here, you could definitely do well with a pie chart. But anyway, just a point to keep in mind, so you don't get too rigid in thinking about pie charts are this way, bar graphs are this way, tables are this way. So let's look at this sample report. So if we look at the question, okay, 1995 to 2002. Okay, so we know that unlike the last example, this is a bar chart which deals with time. So starts in 1995, finishes in 2002. We've got three things: local, national and international fixed line, and mobiles. So it's about calls. If we look at the top, the bar chart, the chart below shows the total number of minutes and billions of telephone calls in the UK divided into three categories from 1995 to 2002. Okay, so, you know, I always find it helpful to look at this as a little bit like a line graph. So if you look at the shape of the light gray lines, they sort of go up and then come back down. Think of that as a line. The white ones, they go pretty steadily up, gradually. And if we look at the black lines, they also go up. If you imagine a line starting in 1995, very low, and then sort of moderately increasing until 1999, and then from that point, the line starts to go up quite sharply from 1999 to 2005. So I always find it helpful to look at a bar graph that deals with time in this particular way, that way, because that will help you come up with your overview. You know, so one of them increased a bit and then returned to its original number. The other one increased gradually, steadily, moderately, and the black one increased moderately at first, but then sharply. So again, that's kind of, I'm already getting into the language that we'll probably see in my overview. So again, if you haven't seen the report yet, you might want to stop, have a look at the graph, and think about what's important and what's not important. Again, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, 3 different pieces of data for each year. That's 24 data points. Again, that's way too many. There's no way we're going to be able to report all of those without being mechanical and redundant and in the time that we have, in the space that we have. So think about that. Also think about how would you group these? So local fixed line calls, national and international fixed line calls, mobile calls. How would you construct 2 detailed paragraphs out of that? Would you go by the different types of, you know, fixed line calls versus mobile calls, or the high one versus the lower ones, something like that? The low and the high in one paragraph, in the middle in the other. So how would you divide up this information? Again, this is one where there's probably lots of different ways you could do that. Think about how you do it, and then we'll have a look at the report that I wrote once you unpause your video. Okay, so let's just go through it. So the bar graph shows telephone calls in Britain from 1995 to 2002 by 3 different types of call. Calls are measured in billions of minutes per year. So I've just given the information here, really, from the question. I've also mentioned the units, so that will be helpful in this one. Sometimes you should do that, sometimes you shouldn't, but it should be clear, you know, what the units are when you're talking about it. You may or may not mention that in your introduction. So Britain, the UK. So that's something English speakers who are not from the UK sometimes confuse. The UK and Britain are synonyms. England and the UK, those are not synonyms. So the UK and Britain are England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. So that is one synonym you can use, but make sure you get it right. And again, as you can see, I pretty much just paraphrased that. So here comes our overview. Overall, the most dramatic increase recorded during the period was in mobile calls. And international fixed line calls saw a more gradual increase. So those are our increases, right? So one has a gradual, one has a more dramatic increase. Okay, so moving to local fixed line calls. While local fixed line calls declined towards the end of the time period, they represent the largest volume of calls throughout. Okay, so if you think about, I've mentioned the increases and the types of increase we've got in the white bars and the black bars, and I didn't mention this increase at the beginning of the fixed line period. I mentioned the decrease towards the end. That seemed more relevant, and also that throughout the period, regardless of where they were in terms of increasing or decreasing, they were the highest volume or the greatest number of calls in billions of minutes. So there's our overview. Concise and very complete. So now in terms of how did I divide it, I chose to put mobile calls in one body paragraph, in one details paragraph, and fixed line calls in the other paragraph. So mobile calls began the period with around 3 billion call minutes in 1995 and steadily rose to just over 10 billion call minutes in 1999. So I've dealt with these first 5 bits. So again, this is the more moderate aspect of the increase. You can see 1995 to 1999. From this point, the figure shot up, quadrupling to around 45 billion call minutes in 2002. So again, 2000, after 1999, the increase becomes much more sharp, and the volume of calls is much, much higher at the end than it was even in the middle of that period. So that's how I mentioned that. Again, I have not mentioned every single data point, so I kind of divided that into 2 different parts, the more moderate increase and the sharp increase, and then described those in a way that was appropriate, using numbers to describe the differences. Okay, the second details paragraph, again, I'm combining local and international fixed line calls as a group. That's logical. So turning to fixed line calls, local calls accounted for around 70 billion call minutes in 1995, growing gradually to around 90 billion in 1999. Following this, the number saw a period of steady decline, finishing the period with a return to baseline in 2002. Okay, so that now I am dealing with this increased part in the beginning and the decreased part in the beginning. So I am talking about the specific details of that. In terms of the numbers of calls, numbers of billions of call minutes, and then I'm going to have a simple description of international. So national and international fixed line calls, on the other hand, recorded consistent increases year on year, starting at just below 40 billion call minutes in 1995 and hitting a high of approximately 60 billion at the period's close. So again, I only mention the beginning and the end here, but I don't really need to, because I said there's a consistent rise year on year. So, you know, this is the beginning, this is the end, and there's a consistent increase every year during the period. That's accurate. And I've used figures enough, numbers enough to describe the data in a way that is going to make the examiner happy. So that's pretty straightforward. Like the other lessons, you can find a second group with groups of words and phrases highlighted. So green, cohesive devices, orange, referencing devices, and then vocabulary. You know, task 1, you're not using a lot of cohesive devices. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's actually fairly high for task 1. Again, I've only used them in places where it was necessary and it would add to the overall clarity of what I'm writing. So overall, here's my overview. While I'm going to give you some contrasting information in the same 2 pieces of contrasting information in the same sentence. Turning to fixed line calls. So again, I've divided the calls from mobile calls and different types of fixed line calls, etc., etc. On the other hand, I'm now giving you some contrasting information. So again, these places make it clear about what type of information is coming next. You generally do not want to start every sentence with a cohesive device, particularly in task 1. So there's quite a lot of good ways of describing, referring to periods, increases, decreases. You'll find that here and in the final lesson of the course. One other quick word about referencing devices. Again, you use these probably without even thinking about them. They are ways to describe something you have already mentioned, and examiners are looking for them. Again, you probably use them acceptably, but you've got to use them well to get 7 or above. So when you get your feedback, make sure that is checked. So let's just look at the last sentence of the second paragraph. While local fixed line calls decline towards the end of the time period, they represent the largest volume of calls throughout. So they just means what? Local fixed line calls. Again, it would be redundant if I said, while local fixed line calls decline towards the end of the time period, local fixed line calls represent the largest volume of calls throughout. That tends to be what lower level students do, because they don't have this ability with referencing devices, which are often pronouns referring to a noun. So again, like I said, you probably do this already, but it is something examiners are looking for at a higher score. So do confirm that before you do the test. And again, it's like anything else. Like, don't try to think about impressing the examiner with your referencing devices. Just use them clearly and accurately so that what you're talking about is easy to follow and easy to understand. Okay, so there's the lesson on bar graphs. Like the other graphs, make sure you understand what type of data that you're dealing with. Practice a variety of questions that present data in different ways in different types of graphs so that when you get to do task 1 on your academic exam, you won't have any problem identifying the type of data and how to report it while you're planning. Do that and you shouldn't have any problem in task 1 of the writing exam.